Hi folks, and welcome back to Conveyancing. This is video 2 in the video series for contract to settlement, the first part of contract to settlement. In the first video, we covered the issue of transfers. We had a look at the documentation required there. We had a look at objections to conveyance, the form of conveyance. We had a look at caveats and priority notices, and now we will look at outgoings, and we'll finish up on time. Hopefully we'll finish on time. Okay, so looking at outgoings. Now, outgoings are defined in clause 1.1 sub 2 sub Z, or Z if you're American, of the REIQ Standard Form Houses of Land Contract. It's also dealt with in clause 2.6, and you'll see I've given you a little screenshot of those two clauses there. So after execution of the contract, obviously as we saw in the other video series, the buyer will assume the risk of loss, most of the loss, almost all of the loss, and the seller is responsible for upkeep of the property to settlement. The seller, in terms of outgoings, will pay things like council rates and so forth, as defined in the definition, any rates or charges on the land by any competent authority. And they'll also pay ordinary expenses of preserving the property. Land tax is a bit of a different issue, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. The buyer pays the proportion of outgoings attributable after settlement. And how does that all happen? The buyer and the seller agree on one of these little nifty settlement statements where all of the adjustments are made to the outgoings as required, and then the monies are set off at settlement. Now, what about capital expenditure? Well, capital expenditure, one-off payments, single non-recurring payments, all of these things are not outgoings, and so they are not going to be apportionable or adjusted between the parties. For example, a notice from an authority requiring the seller to undertake certain works, that is not going to be the kind of thing that will be apportioned between the parties. Rather, that is the kind of thing that will be covered by clause 7.6 of the standard contract. That is requirements of authorities, and the seller will be required to take care of that stuff. Equally though, lump sums that are payable to a seller from a tenant, for example, monies payable for the tenant being in breach for naughtiness, they will also not be apportionable. So I guess it's a swings and roundabouts kind of thing, where there's one-off payments that are due, like for works, then the seller's going to have to take care of those. But if there is money payable to the seller pre-settlement, then equally, where there are one-off kind of payment for things like I mentioned, tenancy disputes and so forth, then they won't be apportionable either. In terms of the way that outgoings are apportioned or adjusted, clause 2.6 sub 2 deals with that. Eminently sensible, really, in terms of divvying up the amounts between the parties. If a bill has already been paid, then the apportionment will be calculated on the actual amount that has been paid by the seller. For charges that have been assessed but unpaid, then the calculation is going to be made on the amount payable, excluding any discounts. Sometimes, for example, for rates, you'll get a discount for paying early. So you've got to exclude those kinds of discounts, and then you'll adjust the amount between the parties. For charges or fees that have yet to be assessed, then you'll generally inquire with the authority as to the amount of the assessment. If there's no advice from the authority, then the best thing you can do is go on the latest assessment there. That's the fairest thing to do. Now, outgoings do not include water rates, and so what has to happen here under 2.6 sub 5 is the buyer has to get the meter read, and then after that we assume that the rate of use continues at the same rate as per the previous notice, the water rates notice to the seller, and that's the way that your water is calculated. Okay, you're just assuming that it stays the same level of consumption. In terms of land tax is actually not apportionable between the parties. The seller has to take care of that one, unfortunately, and it can be a hefty one also. So land tax is imposed on all freehold properties other than your home. Okay, it's a scary thing, as I said, particularly because if it's unpaid, you can rack up an awfully large bill in a relatively short amount of time. Now, that unpaid bill will constitute a charge, a statutory charge over the property that runs with the land. So that charge will have first priority, and the buyer can raise that as an objection to title. Now, the seller can overcome that kind of objection by paying it out at settlement, but if it's a very large sum, it may mean that the transaction falls over. So land tax is one that you need to be careful of. In terms of rent, the text goes into a fair bit of discussion about this. The upshot of it all is really that at common law, rent was not apportioned at common law, but under the REIQ contract, the Standard Houses and Land contract, rent for the current period does have to be apportioned between the parties in accordance with clause 2.6 that we just had a little look at before. Any arrears, however, belong to the seller, so 2.6 sub 7 and also 5.4 ensure that the seller has the right to sue for arrears of rent. So that right is not assigned to the buyer at settlement. Any unpaid rent for the settlement date and the following day is not adjusted until that rent has actually been paid, and any rent paid for the current period or beyond has to be adjusted as at settlement under 2.9. So that's rent there, and that is the issue of outgoings. What about the issue of foreign investors? Now, there's been a fair amount of development on this in a fairly quick time, or what seems like a fairly quick time. So in terms of foreign owners, if they've done something rather naughty and they've failed to notify the Treasurer of a notifiable action or a significant action that relates to the acquisition of Australian residential land, and they've failed to do that before purchasing the land, then have a look at this. The penalty is very, very large, 10% of the amount paid. So where you've got a $1 million property, that's going to be a cool $100,000 penalty. Thank you very much, cha-ching, to Mr. ATO or Ms. ATO. If that's not paid, again, a bit scary, not unlike land tax, it becomes a charge with first priority that runs with the land. So again, failure here to pay means the seller won't be able to hand over a title free of encumbrances, and that will be a defect in the title that the buyer is most likely going to object to, and may well terminate if that kind of thing has not been disclosed. Now, there is a withholding regime that has applied for a couple of years now. Any property over 750,000, so many properties are subject to this regime. The purchaser has to withhold 12.5% of the purchase price if the vendor is a foreign resident and the vendor doesn't provide a clearance certificate or make a relevant declaration. Now, it will be assumed essentially that the vendor is a foreign resident unless they actually do have one of these clearance certificates. So obviously prudent for the seller to obtain one of those. They do last for 12 months. So that is the issue of foreign investors at a very high level, might I add. And now we need to finish on time. Under Section 62 of the Property Law Act, where time stipulations in the contract are not of the essence in equity, they are going to be treated similarly at law. So if there is no stipulation in the contract that would tell equity that time is of the essence, then at both common law and in equity, time will not be of the essence. However, obviously this does not apply if the contract itself states that time is of the essence. Under clause 6.1 of the REIQ, Standard Form Houses and Land, time is definitely of the essence. Day of settlement is of the essence, not hour of settlement. So you can see there, if you, for example, say that settlement can be at 2 p.m. on the 1st of January, actually it would never be then, would it, because it's New Year's Day. But if you said that settlement was 2 p.m. on a specific day, the hour of settlement is not going to be of the essence. So have a look at clause 5.1 for that. We have a breach of a time stipulation, then it's going to be a breach of an essential term. The other party can then terminate without further notice and get their hands on the deposit. Where time is of the essence and a range of time, so we must settle between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. on insert date here, and both the hour and the date are specified as being of the essence, then the hour will be of the essence as well. And that's exactly what happened in the Union Eagle case, where unfortunately for the buyers who tendered their settlement only just a few moments after the time for settlement had passed, it was found that the seller could properly terminate. So these stipulations are not something to be treated lightly, where the hour is of the essence. Even just a few moments will see your client come undone, unfortunately. What about interest that's levied on late payments or payments that are charged for extending the settlement date? Aren't these contradictory with the time stipulation and the idea that time is of the essence? The text has a good old discussion about this, and they conclude that no, these kinds of clauses can coexist with a time of the essence stipulation. However, they say you really do need to be quite careful when you are drafting these kinds of clauses or arrangements for extending the settlement date. You need to make sure that you are drafting the provisions very carefully so that time being of the essence is actually preserved. The other issue I'll flag for you here is that you need to be super careful when you are making arrangements for payment for an extension of a settlement date, that you don't trip up and unfortunately land your transaction into the territory of an instalment contract, as we had a look at in a previous video series. So a couple of issues to watch out there when you are, or your client is looking at levying a payment for extending the settlement date. The same kind of cautions obviously have to be applied where you are drafting anything in one of these contracts, wherever it's possible, try and specify an actual date or a number of days within 14 days or on X date. Try and avoid loose statements like within a reasonable time. That kind of statement will tend to suggest to a court that time is not of the essence. So you want to steer clear of that kind of thing. So that is the issue of interest and payment. Extensions, following on from what we just said, the text has a look at how you actually would classify an extension of time. We have touched on this previously earlier on in the unit, and I'm not going to labour this kind of thing because it's also covered in your contract law unit as well. But mere extensions of time are not considered to be a waiver of the time is of the essence provision. It simply substitutes the new time or date for the old time or date. So really it's just postponing your election to either terminate the contract or affirm the contract itself. Solicitors can quite happily grant extensions of time, so obviously you need to be really careful if you are doing that, because if you do so and you don't have your client's instructions, and preferably written instructions to do so, and then something goes wrong, your client will be held to that extension of time because it is within a solicitor's authority, as I said, to do it. Also within a conveyancer's authority as well, so conveyancing clerks can also do that. A little bit of a word to the wise, always state that time will continue to remain of the essence there, so drafting considerations are always important. Notices is really the last thing that we need to look at today. Again, something that we don't need to go over in depth because it was covered pretty much ad nauseum in your contract law unit and also earlier in the term for this unit. So we'll just give you a bit of a potted summary here, I guess, just to refresh your memory. Notices to complete are those things that you serve when the other party is kind of dragging their heels and not complying with having conditions fulfilled and performing when they need to perform. Where time is not of the essence in a contract generally, you can serve a notice to complete if you are not in default yourself. What it does is it sets up the new date as kind of a marker, a very clear flag for the other party that if they don't actually meet this, then you will take their conduct as a repudiation. So it doesn't actually make time of the essence itself a notice to complete. What it does is it sets up the other party for an action in repudiation that you can, or your client can, accept and then terminate and sue for damages. If there is a specific date in the contract for performance of this item, you need to wait until that date has passed. Once the date is passed, you can actually go ahead and serve the notice to complete. You have to allow a reasonable time for performance. If there's no date in the contract, then you have to wait a reasonable time for performance. Yeah, and only once that reasonable time has elapsed can you serve your notice to complete. That notice to complete itself must allow a further reasonable time for performance, and it's only once that time has elapsed that you can then go ahead and accept their repudiation and terminate. Lorinda and Capalaba Park Shopping Centre is the authority there that you should have looked at in contract law, as I said, ad nauseum pretty much. So that is the issue of notices to complete. The main big ticket items for inclusion in your notice to complete, obviously the parties' names, but you have to tell the other party what they have to do, allow that reasonable time for performance. Anything less than 14 days pretty much is going to be a bit dodgy, according to the case law in a court's eyes. And you need to say the consequences of failure to perform. So say either the contract will be treated as at an end or steps will be taken to enforce it. So the other party has to know that you're really super serious about this, and that's the kind of thing that will then set them up for a repudiation then if they still go ahead and fail to perform once you've actually asked them to. So that is the issue of notices to complete. And that is the issue of time, and hopefully we've finished on time. So that is the first part of our video series on contract settlement, and I'll come back and I will see you for part 2 and the videos in part 2. Until then, bye for now, guys.